when he made me to ask about speaking Hopkins, I had to declare that I wasn't really a Hopkins scholar. I was working on Heaney, but so I suggested to Wayne that I would look at the influence of Hopkins on Heaney, which is huge, especially on the early Heaney. So it might be a nice just balance between the wonderful lecture that Lewis gave on poetics and stuff, so Heaney and then Heaney or Hopkins as an influence. I've just, because I'm going to read some of the poems, we've included them on a sheet. We've squeezed it into 2 pages, so unfortunately some of the line breaks have disappeared, but it shouldn't affect it too much. I don't know if Hopkins would have approved or disapproved of that. So I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts. First is just very basically early influence of Hopkins on Heaney. I refer to Hopkins as a fosterer, and that's deliberate, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The second part is looking at the influence of Hopkins on a very important collection of Heaney's. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Heaney's work, but in 1984 he produced Station Island, which is kind of modelled on Lochlear. And in that book he wrestles hugely with his inherited Catholic pieties in childhood, and he's grappling with that. And in the opening pages of a notebook for that, he has Hopkins as a kind of an exemplary guide who will guide him into middle age, and then he drops Hopkins, and I want to talk about that. And finally then, I want to end with a very moving poem which was never published, or not collected, which takes the title from a Hopkins poem, but it's a beautiful, visionary poem. So I'm going to just jump straight in to the start. I'm going to begin by reading, and it's on the sheet, Fosterage. Heaney included this in his 1975 collection, North. And the fosterer here that he's talking about is a man called Michael McClafferty, who I'll come back to in a moment. But I always suggest that we could also use that as a imagery for Hopkins. So I'll just read the poem. So this is Michael Michael McClafferty talking to Heaney. Description is revelation. Royal Avenue, Belfast, 1962. A Saturday afternoon, glad to meet me, newly culped in language, he gripped my elbow. Listen, go your own way. Do your own work. Remember Catherine Mansfield? I will tell when the laundry basket's squeak. That note of exile. But to hell with overstating it. Don't have the veins bulging in your biro. And then, poor Hopkins. I have the journals he gave me underlined, his buckled self obeising to their pain. He discerned the lineaments of patience everywhere, and fostered me and sent me out with words imposing on my tongue like bubbles. As I said, I begin with this poem because of its title, Fosterage. As you know, fosterage refers to the ancient Irish practice of placing children with other members of the clan so that they could be fostered in various branches of knowledge and trades. And the foster in this case, as I said, is Michael McClafferty. Heaney went to Belfast in 1962 to begin teaching practice, and Michael McClafferty was his headmaster, but also one of the most accomplished short story writers in Ireland. And he lent Heaney 2 books in 1962. One is Patrick Kavanagh's A Soul for Sale, and the other is Hopkins' Journals. Now, Heaney had never heard of Kavanagh, or at least hadn't read Kavanagh, but he had heard of Hopkins, and he heard of him in St. Colum's College, which was also my old school. I was a day boy, Heaney was a boarder. Not at the same time, but so he was introduced to Hopkins at A-level at St. Colum's. And then in 1956, Heaney won a scholarship to Queen's University in Belfast, but he was only 17, and so the scholarship to Queen's was deferred for a year, and he remained in St. Columb's. It was kind of remarkable. So he was outside of lessons. He remained with one of 4 people who were too young to take up the scholarships, and they were under a kind of personal tutor, a man called Sean B. O'Kelly, who had an enormous reputation in St. Columb's as an English teacher, and he kind of took the floor of the class, including Seamus Dean, the literary critic, who died, I think, just last year. So Dean and Heaney and 2 others. And with Kelly, they read the Canterbury Tales, they read Hamlet, and they read the poems of Wordsworth and Keats. But the poems of Hopkins were had the most immediate impact on the young Heaney. And the appeal of Hopkins was not just that his language struck a chord with Heaney, but that his religious formation matched Heaney's experience at St. Columb's. Now, as I say, I had a different experience as a day boy 30 years later, but we still did Mass in the college chapel and so on, where Heaney would have did Mass. And so I had a sense of what it must have been like for the young Heaney serving Mass and so on in St. Columb's. And this is what Heaney says in an interview in 2008. What you encounter in Hopkins' journals, the claustrophobia and scrupulosity and religious ordering of the mind, the cold water shaves and the single iron beds, the soutans and self-denial. That was the world I was living in from when I first read his poems. And then he says to the interviewer, so yes, you're right that it wasn't simply a matter of phonetics taking over. It wasn't just the fireworks in phrases like shining from shoot foil. It was the fact that the height and depth of Hopkins' understanding matched my own. In terms of the language, Heaney found a connection between what he called the heavily accented consonantal noise of Hopkins' poetic voice and the peculiar regional characteristics of a Northern Ireland accent. And in subsequent essays, he repeatedly acknowledges his debt to Hopkins. In 1979, he says, the poetry that meant most to me was Hopkins. So Hopkins is a huge figure in the kind of teenage Heaney. So as I said, he attended Queen's from 1957 till 61, and during that time he published a poem called October Thought in a Queen's University literary magazine. He was 19, and the poem is really a pure pastiche of Hopkins. It was an apprentice piece and was never collected, but its importance lies in the fact that it was the poem which first brought a young Seamus Heaney to the attention of Philip Hobsbawm. Hobsbawm, you may know, was an influential English poet and critic who was teaching at Queen's at the time, and he convened, as he had in Cambridge beforehand, he convened a group of talented young poets, others included Derek Mahon, Michael Longley, and he read October Thought in the magazine and then approached Heaney. So he's huge in terms of really getting Heaney's career up and running. So I just begin. So again, it's on the handout. I mean, it's almost more Hopkins than Hopkins, but I'll just read it as best I can. So this is Heaney at 19. Starting thatch watches and sudden swallow, straight breaks to its mud nest, home rest rafter. Up through dry, dusk-drunk cobwebs, like laughter flitting the roof of black oak, bog sod, and rods of willow. And twittering flirtings in the eaves as sparrows quarrel. Haystacks, straw broken and strewn, hide, here mice meeting in the grain, gnawing strong the iron-bound, swollen and ripe round corn barrel. Minute movement, millionfold, whispers twilight under heaven hue, plum blue, and gorse pricked with gold. And through the knuckle gnarl of branches, poking the night, comes the trickling tinkle of bells, well in the fold. So the poem is full of the consonants Hopkins loved, and Heaney's poetic ear vibrates to the sound of the swallow's flight home, which we hear in the sibilants in the opening line and in the internal echo of thatch watches. It's also full of examples of compounds, a literary device favoured by Hopkins, so we have home rest, dust drunk, right round, etc. And the alliteration of rest and rafter emphasises just how homely the mud nest is. And then in the next line, the rhyming laughter plays on the idea of the drunkenness of the cobwebs in the same line. We also have the wonderful vowel sounds in the line, flitting the roof of black oak, bog sod, and raws of willow. And then the alliteration of the nasal consonant M in minute movement millionfold alongside whispers conveys the almost inaudible and gentle pattering of mice meeting in the grain, reinforced in the final line by the trickling tinkle of bells. In 1980, Heaney published an essay on Hopkins called The Fire in the Flint, Reflections on the Poetry of Gerard Hopkins. And in that essay he sets up two modes of language which he thought broadly representative of Hopkins and Keats. The masculine mode, Hopkins, has to do with a poetic effort where words are, quote, athletic, capable, displaying the muscle of sense. And the feminine mode, for Keats, where words are less a labour of design and more, to quote Heaney, the lovers come hither. And we can trace that definition of words as displaying the muscle of sense in some early poems of Heaney. In Death of an Actualist, in his first collection, we can detect that muscular language in the opening lines of Churning Day, where Heaney describes his mother churning butter in the kitchen. And he opens that poem, it's not on your handout, he opens that poem, it's just 3 lines, the first 3 lines. A thick crust, coarse grain as limestone, rough cast, hardened gradually on top of the 4 crocks that stood large pottery bombs in the small pantry. So there's your compounds again, coarse grain, rough cast, and so on. And the language is in itself is coarse grain as the process it describes. And of course, coarse grain, another example of Heaney's fondness for compound words and imitation of Hopkins. So we can think, for example, of examples of compounds in Hopkins's poetry include Heaven Haven, Heaven Gravel, Churl's Grace, Ammon Strength, and of course, Dapple, Dawn, Drawn, Falcon in the Windhover. And much later, Heaney revised, as he thought, he said in 1989 that Churning Day had too many words in it. He said, and it's interesting, he said, it's kind of thick, in love with the idea of writing like Hopkins. So it's just interesting, Heaney's observation in 1989. But you still get the powerful rhythmic control of Hopkins was what most appealed to Heaney at the beginning. And one of his earliest poems, which I'm sure all of you will know, Digging, about digging turf with his father, you find Hopkins' fondness for alliteration is clear in Heaney's description of his father digging peat. So the line, for example, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge. So you get all that again, lovely alliteration. So I said that Michael McClafferty gave Heaney a copy of Hopkins' journals in 1962. And there are 2 notable passages in the journals where Hopkins describes the inscape of bluebells. So, inscape here really has to do with the essence or substance of a thing, which gives it its own particularity. And I'm just going to read the example because it's beautiful. Again, this is from Hopkins' journals. The bluebells in your hand baffle you with their inscape, made to every sense. If you draw your fingers through them, they are lodged and struggle with a shock of wet heads. The long stalks rub and click and flatten to a fan on one another, like your fingers themselves would when you pass the palms hard across one another, making a brittle rub and jostle, like the noise of a hurdle strained by leaning against. Then there is the faint honey smell, and in the mouth the sweet gum when you bite them. So in that short passage, Hopkins is engaging every sense. We've got sight, touch, smell, sound, and taste. And by doing so, of course, he kind of reels us in to experience the beauty of the bluebell. And his journals, as much as the poems, testify to his remarkable ability to revel and to marvel in the particularity of all things, so that in another part of the journals, Hopkins' ear is even alert to the lisp of the swallow's wings. In another entry in the journals from the 3rd of August 1872, Hopkins tells us that he first got hold of a copy of the sentences of the medieval theologian and philosopher Duns Scotus, and that, quote, "Just then when I took in any inscape of the sky or sea, I thought of Scotus." So, medieval philosophers and theologians were concerned to understand how we could understand the universal. And for Scotus, the answer was to be found in the individuation of persons and things. And so it was to Scotus that Hopkins owed the idea of hexetus, or thisness, the idea that each finite thing, such as the bluebell, had its own particularity or individuation, and that this individuation was also to be found in activity. So, for example, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. And alongside Hopkins' notion of inscape, and Lewis alluded to this already, was of course the notion of instress. And Mark Dubois, who's a Hopkins scholar in Durham, points out that instress holds a double meaning, and again I quote, "indicating at once the force of being which upholds the inscape and the effect of observing the inscape on the beholder." And I'm just going to try to kind of find an illustration from Hopkins, and again, this is from the journals. Hopkins says, "Take a few primroses in a glass, and the instress of brilliancy, sort of starriness, I have not the right word, so simple a flower gives, is remarkable." So instress is the force or the feeling of the particular thing which is held in the inscape. And we find that, for example, in a poem of Heaney's from 2006. The poem is called "A Shiver," and it's the best description I've seen of someone sledging a wall. And for Heaney describes the instress, if you like, of the sledging of the wall. He said it was something particular in your bones, even the shiver of an inanimate sledgehammer. And again, I'll just quote 3 lines. He says, "A first blow that could make air of a wall, a last one so unanswerably landed, the staked earth quailed and shivered in the handle." So this lovely image of the earth coming up through the handle. Now that appeared in this written circle in 2006, which was almost 50 years after October Thought. So again, long after the early prestige of Hopkins is gone, Hopkins continues to inform Heaney's poetry at a deep level. Hopkins, of course, as you know, his imagination was shaped by his reading of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And as a priest, he would have been familiar with the exercises as a source of spiritual guidance. But as a poet, he would have been equally attached to the part that the 5 senses played in the various contemplations. So on contemplating, for example, the nativity of Jesus, St. Ignatius writes, and again I quote, "Look in imagination at the persons, meditating and studying in detail the situation in which they find themselves. Then listen to what they are saying. Then smell the indescribable fragrance and taste the boundless sweetness of the divinity. And finally, touch by kissing and clinging to the places where these persons walk or sit." So the attraction of the spiritual exercises as a way of engaging the imagination and using the 5 senses to come to a deeper understanding of spiritual reality was apparent not only to Hopkins, but also to earlier religious poets such as George Herbert, for example, for whom Hopkins had a particular affection, and to John Donne in his Holy Sonnets, they undoubtedly drew on the Ignatian meditation. And like Hopkins, Heaney had an affection for Herbert too. I was just speaking with someone last week actually in Cambridge, an Anglican bishop there who was talking about how apparently towards the end of his life Heaney was reading a lot of Herbert. But there's a lengthy discussion of Herbert's poem The Pulley, for example, in the opening lecture of Heaney's The Redress of Poetry. So again, we find echoes of Hopkins' journals in Heaney's early work. It's a mark, for example, of Hopkins' appreciation of the inscape and individuation of all things, that on a visit to Lucerne in 1868, he found beauty in a barn. And I quote Mrs. Hopkins, "In leaving Lucerne, saw the best shaped and proportioned barn I ever saw." This is lovely, it's something so simple, and Hopkins is writing about it. Then you get it in Heaney. So Heaney, in his first collection again, has a poem called The Barn. And Heaney writes, so as the poet enters the barn and his eyes adjust to the light, he says, "A scythe's edge, a clean spade, a pitchfork's prongs, slowly bright objects formed when you went in." And then in describing the blooms on firs or gorse, Hopkins writes that the wings or crests rising behind the nibs of each flower, he says, "make a little square with 4 walls. Now these little walls are like the partitions in honeycombs." I've got that line, it's squeezed, I'm afraid, after it overthought. So it's down there, kind of 2/3 of the way down the page. And then you find a similar simile in Heaney in his poem Thatcher, which is on your page again. It's slightly squeezed. Heaney says, "Couching for days on sods above the rafters, he shaved and flushed the butts, stitched all together into a sloped honeycomb, a stubble patch, and left him gaping at his Midas touch." So the richness of the Thatcher's art is brought out not only in the reference to Midas, but in the ordered shape and golden sweetness of the honeycomb, which seems to be the apt metaphor for the rich golden colour of the firs or of the gorse. And then one final example in parallel with Heaney. Hopkins describes the sunset on the 12th of March 1870, and he writes, "It was all active and tossing out light, and started as strongly forward from the field as a long stone or a boss in the knot of the chalice stem." And then you have Heaney, if we go back to Churning Day, Heaney's also describing the light in the kitchen, and he says, "Gold flecks began to dance," this is on as they're churning the butter, "gold flecks began to dance, and the curd thickened was heavy and rich, coagulated sunlight, heaped up like gilded gravel in the bowl." And so you get your parallel there with the boss and the chalice stem. And that use of the simile to liken the light of the sun to the boss and the knot of a chalice stem, that set a precedent really for Heaney's use of Catholic iconography, which is a whole other story, but it's fascinating. So in Hopkins then, Heaney found a vigour in terms of rhythm, and a sacramental vision in terms of attention to the inscape and the in-stress of things. But together with Patrick Kavanagh and Ted Hughes, he also found permission to write about the earth experience of the world he inhabited and which inhabited him. So Hopkins' treatment of rural and agricultural life and the dignity it assumed in taking on a verse life appealed to the young Heaney. So in his poem Follower, Heaney's poem Follower, we find clear echoes, for example, of Hopkins' Hardy Ploughman, 2 poems which sanctify the act of ploughing by describing it. So in Hopkins, the physicality of the ploughman and his work is described as, quote, "head and foot, shoulder and shank, by a grey eye's heed, steered well, one crew fall to," and so on. And that nautical metaphor of crew is found in Heaney also. So here's Heaney in digging. "My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders glowed like a full sail strung between the shafts and furrow." And then Hopkins' grey eyes heed becomes in Heaney, his eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. And the sheer rhythm of Hopkins's ploughman is wonderfully evoked as one where sucked or sank, soared or sank. And just as Heaney remembers being carried on his father's back and dipping and rising to his plod. And then finally the broad and bluff hide of Harry Ploughman's feet finds an echo in Heaney's father in his broad shadow around the farm. So I want to just talk a little bit about Hopkins's Felix Randall and Seamus Heaney's The Forge, both poems celebrating the work of individuals known to each poet. Felix Randall, as you know, commemorates a young Liverpool blacksmith whose real name was Felix Spencer. He died on the 21st of April 1880 at the age of 31 during Hopkins's time as a priest at Francis Xavier's. And even as Hopkins laments the sickness which broke him, he celebrates a man big-boned and hardy handsome. And then he recalls, when thou at the Randall Brim forge, powerful amidst peers, didst fettle for the great grey horse, his bright and battering sandal. I'll come back to that bright and battering sandal later because it's important in the second part of the talk. So that was Hopkins's blacksmith. Heaney's blacksmith was a man called Barney Devlin, who ironically outlived Heaney. He only died about 5 years ago. He died 10 years ago this August. Barney Devlin was a local neighbour near Heaney's farm, the family farm Moss Pond in County Derry. And Heaney has a wonderful sonnet called The Forge, in which he likens the altar, the anvil, which I see in the front of Annie's wonderful, where it is here. We've got the anvil up here. So, if I can just digress slightly, because when I was looking at this poem, the poem, so Heaney is basically consecrating the work of the blacksmith. So he says, the anvil must be somewhere in the centre, horned as a unicorn, at one end square, set there immovable, an altar where he expends himself in shape and music. And just out of interest, this is a slight digression, but that was published in 1969. In 1966, Heaney published the same poem in the Times Literary Supplement. And when I looked at it, often I would try and get the earliest version of the poem and the later ones to see if there are changes. When I looked at the two poems, I glanced at it and it appears that there were no changes. And then I went back to the TLS one and read it slowly. And that line where he said, in the TLS version, he talks about the anvil, and he said it was set there immovable like an altar. So the anvil's an altar, it's a simile, of course, so it's like an altar. And then he changes it in the published version and takes out the word like and puts in a colon and says, set there immovable, an altar. No, it is an altar. Not just like an altar, it is an altar. And so the blacksmith, in a sense, becomes a priestly figure. And if you jump forward, again, this is not the talk, it's slightly off topic slightly, but the wonderful sonnet for Heaney's mother, which I'm sure you know from Clearances 3, where he talks about his peeling potatoes with his mother, and his mother's dying, and the priest is saying the prayers, and Heaney's there as a boy, and people are crying, as a man, and they're crying, and he thinks back, as the priest saying the prayers, he has this reverie memory of peeling potatoes with his mother, and he talks about him dropping into this bucket of clean water. But in that poem he says, so while the parish priest went hammer and tongs at the prayers for the dying. Now the hammer and tongs, of course, is something you associate with the blacksmith, not the priest. And I don't know if that was conscious, but there's something playful about, he consecrates the blacksmith as a priest kind of figure at the altar, and then the priest becomes a kind of a blacksmith, hammer and tongs at the prayers. Anyway, I'll get back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. So the Forge, like the Windhover and Felix Randall, is a sonnet, and Heaney's fondness for the sonnet was in no small measure down to Hopkins's use of the form. So like Hopkins, he used it at key points in his life. One was the death of his mother, when he has that long sequence of poems, Clearances, all in sonnet form in the Hall Lantern. And as you know, the heart of the sonnet form is the turn, normally after the octave, where the poet attempts to resolve in the sestet the complex scenario that she or he has established in the octave. So in the wind cover, for example, the beauty of the falcon battling against the big wind described so vividly in the octave is sung by result in the sestet where the humble plowshare and dying embers like the falcon can triumph over adversity and shine forth in the renewal of the ordinary. So, I'm going to leave that. That's so I hope you can see there the obvious influence of Hopkins and Heaney at different levels, consciously and I think possibly unconsciously. What I want to do now in the second part is just talk about Hopkins as an exemplary guide. So this is based on research I did in the National Library of Ireland on Heaney's notebook for Station Edit. So Station Edit is this, as I said, key text from 1984 where Heaney, I mean, it's the only time ever in a notebook where you get a sense of Heaney being angry. And so he's clearly, he's starting to grapple with all of his childhood inheritances in terms of politics, faith and so on. And he's trying to, in some sense he's trying to free himself as a poet to write stuff that's airier, lighter. He doesn't quite do it. He achieves the likeness, but he doesn't quite let go of what he has inherited, and I think that's part of the tension and the contradiction in Heaney, which is really important. So in that, it's a wonderful. I mean, so he imagines himself on Loch Eyre, the penitential pilgrimage, Donegal, and he did it 3 times as a young man, and so he knows it intimately. And he imagines meeting so he goes off, he leaves the mainland to go off to the island by boat, and then he meets ghosts on the island who essentially chastise him for various things. And of course, which is very humbling and very powerful. This is Heaney chastising himself, sometimes in the most extraordinary ways, publicly. And then he leaves the island after poem 11, and he gets a boat across to the other side, and he meets the ghost of Joyce. And this is what Joyce says to him. So Joyce is surprised to see him on the island, and he says to Heaney, the ghost of Joyce, "You are raking at dead fires, rehearsing the old whinges of your age. That subject people's stuff is a cod's game, infantile like this peasant pilgrimage. You lose more of yourself than you redeem doing the decent thing. Keep it a tangent." This is Joyce, it's very direct. Of course, you always have to remember it's Heaney. But in the second poem of that sequence, he meets the ghost of the 19th century writer William Carton. And Carton had written an article called The Loch Eyre Pilgrim in the 19th century, in which he attacked the popular piety of Loch Eyre as what he called mistaken devotion. And Carton lambasts Heaney, and again I quote, "O holy Jesus Christ, does nothing change?" So this is really heavy kind of stuff. But the most personal accusation comes in poem 8, where the ghost of Heaney's second cousin, Colin McCartney, appears. Now, in real life, Colin McCartney and his friend were murdered in a sectarian assassination in 1975. They were coming back from Dublin, a GAA match, and they were just stopped at a roadblock. They were told they needed to go, and they were shot. Both of them were shot in the back of the head. And Heaney was deeply affected by it, but he was at Jerpoint at the time, at a poet's gallery, and he didn't make it to the funeral. And he writes an elegy for Colin, which is called The Strand at Loch Beg in 1979, and it's absolutely beautiful. And he imagines, he's trying to atone for not being there at the funeral, so he imagines washing the face of, taking Colin out of the mud where he fell when he was shot, and washing his face with the morning dew, the way that Virgil washed the face of Dante in the Purgatorio. But then on Station Island, the ghost of Colin appears to Heaney and chastises him for exactly that. And he says to him, "The Protestant who shot me through the head, I accuse directly, but indirectly you, who now atone perhaps upon this bed for the way you whitewashed ugliness and drew the lovely lines of the Purgatorio and saccharine my death with morning dew." I mean, it's so intense. And again, we have to keep remembering this is not Colin McCartney, of course, it's Heaney, chastising Heaney. But what I would want to suggest, I think the poems of stage 10, they're self-excoriating, and in them I think we see a reflection of the buckled self. To borrow that phrase that appears in that very first poem, the buckled self of Hopkins in the journals. And the great irony of that is that in an attempt to free himself from the obligations of his inherited Catholic piety, of course he employs the Catholic examination of conscience to do so. So apart from parallels with Hopkins' self-scrutiny and his buckled self in the journals, where else does Hopkins fit into Station Island? In poem 5, again he meets the ghost of Michael McClafferty, so the short story writer and his former headmaster. And McClafferty says to Heaney, "We'll go someday to my uncle's farm at Toon." Another master spoke. "For what is the great moving power and spring of verse, feeling and in particular love?" So the ghost of McClafferty is quoting the ghost of Hopkins. That line is taken from a letter Hopkins sent to Robert Bridges on the 15th of February 1879, when he wrote, "Feeling, love in particular, is the great moving power and spring of verse, and the only person that I'm in love with, God, seldom, especially now, stirs my heart sensibly." Now, you've got those allusions to Hopkins, but if we take the entire text of Station Island, Hopkins is, at face value, conspicuously absent as a fosterer. And what is generally agreed among Heaney scholars is that Heaney incrementally divests himself of his childhood piety and faith in the sequence, which reaches that crescendo with the advice of Joyce at the end. However, in the penultimate poem of the sequence 11, Heaney meets the ghost of a Carmelite priest. And the ghost, like the other ghosts, is based on an historical figure, in this case a Carmelite priest who delivered a retreat to the pupils at St. Colum's when Heaney was in his final year. And Heaney says this about the priest in Stepping Stones, which is a long series of interviews with Dennis O'Driscoll. So Heaney says about the priest, "He had just come back from Spain and seemed to shine with inner light. And he did say to me, 'Read poems as prayers.' He would probably have explained that what he meant by quoting Hopkins, 'The world is charged with the grandeur of God,' and by saying that God's grandeur shines out in the shook foil of poetry. I could and can see the sense of that, and the point of reading poems in that spirit." But what I want to argue is that the Carmelite priest, I think, is a kind of compound ghost figure in the manner of the compound ghost in T.S. Eliot's poem Little Gidding. In the Little Gidding passage, just before dawn, Eliot's persona meets the figure with a down-turned face. And this is what Eliot says about him. "Whom I had known, forgotten, half recalled, both one and many, in the brown-baked features, the eyes of a familiar compound ghost." Now, Eliot suggested in a letter in 1961 that he was thinking of W.B. Yeats. And we know that Little Gidding was a favourite poem of Heaney's. He read it, for example, at the Church of St. John of Little Gidding in 2002. But what I want to argue is that the Carmelite priest may be a compound ghost figure of the priest he met at St. Colum's and Hopkins. And so what do I base this argument on? Well, there are two things. One is Heaney's notebook, and secondly then a close reading of the text itself, which we have in the handout. So first, the notebook. On page 70, so Heaney rarely, in the draft, I have to do all the drafts of this poetry in the National Library, and most of them are simply scribbles. He starts his poem and he changes this and he changes that. But Station Island has a complete notebook of about 180 pages of Heaney, and you get anger in it, you get frustration in it. He talks about it himself. He said, "Last night I had too much smoking, too much whiskey, feeling dreadful today," and all this kind of stuff. So it's great to get an insight into the human being. Heaney's such a kind of, as you said earlier, the saintly figure now that it's great to see that he's also a human being, being suffered hangovers. And well, on page 76 of that book, he makes a list, he begins to compile a list of people who will be ghosts on the island. And he says, it's just at the very bottom, he says, Hopkins at the end, Joyce on the other side. So Hopkins, the last ghost who meets on the island, Hopkins, the ghost who meets off the end. And then he says in more detail on page 103, This is the 16th of January 1981, so 3 years before the stage end was published. Heaney continues to explore characters who would appear at the beginning and end, and he writes, at the beginning, those who define what is produced as self. At the end, characters with guiding or exemplary traits to help one into middle life. And then he has Hopkins, question mark. No, then Hopkins completely disappears, seemingly from the text. So, which is why I think if he meant that much to Hopkins to Heaney in the early development of the poem, that he doesn't quite disappear, that he appears somehow in the figure of the Carmelite priest. And the only way I can argue that is with the text. So you have the text, stage 11. Again, the lines have been squashed here, so it's not. It's in tercets, so 3 lines, and if you can imagine a gap. But I'll just read this. It's absolutely it's Heaney at his best, I think. So here he imagines the ghost of the priest appearing to him. As if the prisms of the kaleidoscope, I plunged once in a butt of muddy water, surfaced like a marvellous lightship. And out of its silted crystals, a monk's face that had spoken years ago from behind a grill, spoke again about the need and chance to salvage everything, to re-envisage the zenith and glimpse jewels of any gift mistakenly abased. What came to nothing could always be replenished. Read poems as prayers, he said, and for your penance, translate me something by Juan de la Cruz. Returned from Spain to our chapped wilderness, his consonants aspirate, his forehead shining, he made me feel there was nothing to confess. Now his sandal passage stirred me on to this. How well I know that fountain filling, running, although it is the night. Now then he goes on, he translates the whole John the Cross poem, which I haven't included here. Now, when that priest gave the retreat, Heaney was also in the class with Sean B. O'Kelly reading Hopkins. And so there may, again, he may in his mind, all this may be kind of morphing into kind of one person. And Heaney, so the priests in Collins was run by diocesan priests, not by order priests, but they always had order priests, religious orders come and give the retreats. And Heaney sees something different in the Carmelite. He returns from Spain, so there's a kind of a more expansive vision of Catholicism, perhaps. And he conveys something different to the rule-bound ethic of Irish Catholicism, which Heaney was brought up in. So Heaney says in the extract, he made me feel there was nothing to confess. And he advises the young Heaney to read poems as prayers, and then asks him to translate something from the Carmelite friar and mystic St. John of the Cross. But it's the final 3 lines of the text on your page which makes me think of Hopkins. Now his sandal passage stirred me on to this. How well I know that fountain, filling, running, although it is the night. Now there are 3 words in that text which remind me of Hopkins, and they kind of jump out. The first is sandal. So in the monk's sandal passage, we find an echo, I think, of Hopkins and the bright and battering sandal of Felix Randall, a poem we saw, which was very important to me. The second word is stirred. A word we find, of course, in Hopkins is the wind hover. So I'm going to read this one. Reading the wind hover, you can take your life in your own hands, but I'll have an attempt. And you get the word stirred at the end. So I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dolphin, dappled dawn drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth and swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a boat end, and the hurl and gliding rebuff the big wind, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. So there's stirred. So the sandal passage, Felix Randall possibly stirred, the wind hover, and then the final word is night. And it's in the refrain of the poem, I think, that we find the deeper spiritual parallel with Hopkins. In the sermons and devotional writings of Hopkins, we find the line, "This life is night, it is a night it is a dark time. And in Heaney's refrain, we find, I think, a felt spiritual synthesis of St. John of the Cross and the dark night of the soul. And the paradox of the mystical tradition is that in this darkness comes a felt knowledge of God as a living fountain. So unlike the butt of muddy water that Heaney plunges the kaleidoscope into at the beginning of the poem, at the end of the poem he says that God's love is so pellucid it can never be muddied. So, coming as it does, I think, as the penultimate poem of the sequence, Heaney's encounter with the ghost of the Carmelite monk undermines a reading of the sequence in which Heaney incrementally divests himself of a religious sensibility. What he encounters instead, I argue, is a more expansive vision of Catholicism in which he can read poems as prayers and in which he is encouraged to salvage everything which shaped his sensibility. It was not necessary for Heaney, for Station Island to end up either as an act of faith or unfaith, as he suggested to Fintan O'Toole at the time in the Tribune. It was necessary only to clear a blockage so that he could move forward with a sense of inner and artistic freedom. It was important for him to jettison certain attitudes to his inherited religious obligations, but not the source of those whose felt sense he could turn to poetry. So, to conclude, so this is Hopkins and Heaney's late work, or later work. Two beautiful poems. So he's there in Station Island as a possible exemplary guide. He then kind of disappears. I'm arguing he reappears in the form of the Carmelite priest, but he appears very much again in later Heaney. But it's no longer the pastiche of October Thought from 1959. Instead, Heaney has accommodated and absorbed Hopkins' vision of the world into his own poetic vision. So one of the things I said about Station Island was that Heaney wanted he felt he was weighed down by religious and political obligations, and there's no doubt that after Station Island, and especially after the death of his mother, she died in the same year, 1984, Heaney's poetry becomes lighter. He writes the Hall Lantern, it's obsessed by absence and by space and by light, and the poetry of seeing things in 1981, I think it's an extraordinary volume of the material given away to the visionary. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. So I'm just going to, in that light, say something about that before we finish. So, one of the poems, which was never published, and I think it's beautiful, it was published, not collected, it was published in the Threepenny Review in 2000, and it's called The Dearest Freshness, which again, of course, is from God's Grandeur. Hopkins is not in the poem, but the spirit of Hopkins is in it, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I'll read it, and I hope I don't get it here. I hope I can convey something of the visionary quality of it. It's very simple. Heaney's obviously out he's at some poetry reading, and this lady comes, she's supposed to read, she forgets her book, she drives back to the house to get the book, and then she comes back, and she tells the story of children who look into a pool of water. That's it. Very simple, but I think it's lovely. So God's Grandeur, Hopkins had said, and for all this nature is never spent, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. So the poem of Heaney's from 2000 is called The Dearest Freshness. Clearable water, there from the start, the sight and run of it, unpolluting itself from the muck of dry work, so quickly I remember eating snow. And one night at a party in Fayetteville, Arkansas, a woman leaving, driving home, then driving herself straight back with the book she meant to read from. Her accent was southern, perfect for each voice in the little scene she chose from a story set in a field beside a river. Children playing stop and line up and cannot take their eyes off something deep in the flow. And then one says, "That's us down there," and it goes clean through me. That's us down there. I see us every time. So that was 2000. The following year, Heaney published Electric Light, in which again he borrows a title from Hopkins for his poem Seeing the Sick. Heaney's father, Patrick Heaney, died in 1986, and the poem Seeing the Sick describes the last days of his father, where he received morphine to ease the pain. And Heaney likens his father to Felix Randall, and the title of the poem is taken from that poem where Hopkins writes, "This seeing the sick endears them to us too it endears." So he begins the poem with another phrase from Felix Randall where Hopkins describes the farrier as, quote, being anointed and all. And Heaney also makes use of, again, a number of compound words as a device as we saw favoured by Hopkins. So here's the poem again, it's on your sheet, Seeing the Sick. And again, I think without, you can read too much into this, but he capitalizes obviously the A for anointed, and but also the capital O below it, and possibly the alpha and the omega. Now you read too much, the beginning and the end. This is a poem about the end of his father's life. And if we go back to digging, follower, those early poems, he is obsessed with guilt about not following his father he was the eldest son, and he would have been expected to take over the farm, but he becomes a writer, and he can't quite get around the guilt of that. So I wonder really, is it a play of alpha and omega, the beginning and the end? Anointed and all, my father did remind me of Hopkins' Felix Randall. And then he grew, as he would have said himself, wee in his clothes, spectral, a relict, and seemed to have grown so because of something spectral he'd thrown off, the unbelonging moorland part of him that was Northumbrian, the bounden he who had walked the streets of Hexham at 18 with a stick and tasked with bringing home the dead body of his uncle by cattle ferry. Ghost rover from the start, brandisher of keel, none of your fettled and bright battering sandal, cow-dung coloured tweed and ox-blood leather. The assessor's eye, the tally keeper's head, for what beasts were on what land, in what year, but then that went as well. And all precaution. His smile, a summer half door, opening out and opening in, a reprieving light for which the tender morphine had our thanks. So he describes his father there as spectral, and we're back again to the ghost of Station Island really, and a relic. And the word relic appears once more in Heaney's poem District and Circle in 2006, and I'll finish with this, where he imagines seeing the ghost of his father's face in the window of a tube train. So District and Circle, it's marvellous. I mean, it plays, it's the District line and the Circle line in London, but it's also, he's circling around the district of Mossbawn in his childhood. I mean, the poems are, again, constantly back to his childhood, constantly back to his parents. His final of Human Chain is just part where he again talks about the ghosts of his parents. So he's in a tube train, it's hurtling through the underground, he's holding on to one of the straps, and he sees his own face, but sees his father in the back, in his own face, if you like. So I just quote from it, it's a long poem, I just quote the last part. So deeper into it, crowd swept, strap hanging, my lofted arm a swivel like a flail, my father's glazed face and my own waning and craning. Again the growl of shutting doors, the jolt and one-off treble of iron on iron, then a long centrifugal haulage of speed through every dragging socket. And so by night and day to be transported through gallery to earth with them, the old relic of all that I belong to, hurtled forward, reflecting in a window moor-backed by blasted weeping rock walls, flicker-lit. So again, there are several compound words in that poem, including crowd swept, strap hanging, and moor-backed. And they remind us of October Thought, one of Heaney's apprentice poems from 1959, but also of the enduring presence of Hopkins in Heaney's work. And if Heaney's father is spectral, so too is Hopkins. that foster who tutored Heaney from the beginning of his writing life. Thank you.
It's just a small point really, and you mentioned a number of times the compound words, which are usually hyphenated compounds, and longer or shorter. But there's one you use with a man's strength, which is a single.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary the way he does. It doesn't do that.
It's probably not fair. Maybe it's not fair to call it compound. I don't know, but he doesn't have he doesn't have the dashes. Yeah.
No, and it's spelled with a capital A.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's a sort of quality, or a child of a man, or a person. You take the items out.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yes.
I just bring you to Sean D. O'Kelly, English teacher. We all learned Hopkins in school, and I'm sure you did as well. Did Sean D. O'Kelly put an emphasis on Hopkins on you during the time there? And obviously,
I was 30 years old, younger than Heaney, so Sean D. O'Kelly would go on by my time, and it was an unusual, I think, setup where. I mean, this didn't happen in my time, but that someone like Heaney would be a year too young to go on to university, so he just stayed behind it. But I know that O'Kelly, I'm not sure if O'Kelly put any more emphasis on Hopkins than he did on Wordsworth or Chaucer, but I mean, these were to be getting this stuff at 17, 18 was remarkable, really. I mean, the other big influence in that regard, I should say, is when I first got to St. Colum's, my father dropped me at the same door that Heaney's parents dropped him at, junior house door. Heaney was dropped there and went there in 1951, and he talked about the loneliness of it. But what's lovely, a slight anecdote, but is that before, so Derry's on the border with Donegal, and Heaney's parents, who wouldn't have been, they were farmers, but not a huge farm, and they had a car, and a neighbour drove them, and before they went to St. Colum's, they insisted that they would go to Buncrana, which is about 12 miles from Derry. And in Buncrana they went to a pen shop and they bought Seamus Conley Stewart fountain pen, which he wrote with the rest of his life. And the following day he wrote back to his parents about his first day as a boarder. And that pen now is, you can see it actually, there's an exhibition of Heaney's in Malahi, and the pen's there. And I just thought to myself, they could not possibly have known, nor could he have known, where that pen would take him. But he was dropped there in 1951, and I was dropped there at the same door in 1982 by my father. And when I was dropped off, I remember the school was run by a priest, and I remember seeing an old priest who wasn't a teacher when I was there, but an old priest walking along reading his breviary. And I subsequently learned that his name was Michael McGlinchey, and he taught Heaney Latin, and Heaney adored him. When Heaney died, McGlinchey taught book on the syllabus that he was book 2 or book 1 of the Aeneid, but apparently McGlinchey kept saying, "Oh boys, I wish it was book 6." And Heaney couldn't understand why it was. And Heaney saved up his pocket money at 16, got a bus to Belfast, went to a second-hand bookshop and got a copy of the Aeneid 6, and then Heaney dies, and the family were clearing up his desk, and on the desk was a full translation of an Aeneid 6, and the opening translator's note said, "This is an act of," what did they say, what's the word? This is meant to honour the memory of Father Michael McGlinchey. And he was too, and the Guardian at the time published this translator's note, and it's an incredible tribute to Michael McGlinchey, who shaped him enormously. So St. Colum's Seamus Dean as well, great literary critic, and who spent most of his time in Notre Dame in America. John Hume was around that time, the Nobel Prize winner. So it was a real terrific.
Eamon McCann.
Eamon McCann, yeah. But the last book, and I didn't go on it here because of the Hopkins thing, but Human Chain is worth reading. It's absolutely beautiful. And he talks about watching his parents leave. So he goes right back to the start, you know. And it's beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Do you know what I get from all the people who write about Heaney and what you're saying, what you've given us this morning, for which many, many thanks, is a great sense of warmth and love that came from Heaney.
Yeah.
That, for me, is the overriding thing.
Well, if I can tell you, Irene, on that, and again, I don't want to take up everybody's time, but it's a lovely story. So, I taught in St. Collins also in 2005, and I invited Heaney to give a lecture. I was teaching ancient history, Greek and Roman history at A level, and I asked Heaney if he would come and give a lecture, and he came back straight away and said, yes, I'll come in January, Garrett. And he wanted to come for the day. He was flying on to Derry from Dublin at 9 in the morning, and he said to me, Gary, I wonder is there any chance we could go and see Brian Freed, who lived in Donegal. He'd had a stroke. And I said, yeah, of course, Seamus, the lecture's at 4. And then the president of the college said to me, look, Gary, take him somewhere nice, posh for lunch. And I thought, having known his work, I thought, he was a kind of a superstar. I mean, that, when we got off the airport, people were shouting, there's Seamus Heaney. You know, he's like Bono, you know. And so I thought, well, I know what I'll do, I'll take him to my parents' house. Now, my parents left school at 16, and he said about his own parents that they weren't literary, but they weren't illiterate. And I would say about my own parents, you know, that they were intelligent people, but they had to leave school at 16 to work.
Sorry?
They had to leave school at 16 to work, you know. And so I brought Heaney, I said to my mother, it was a great, I said to my mother one day, I was really excited, and I said, Mum, I'm going to bring someone for lunch, could you make lunch for them? And she said, yes, no problem, son. And she didn't ask me who it was. And I was kind of, and I said, do you know who it is, Mum? And she said, no. And I said, it's Seamus Heaney. And she just went, oh, okay. And I was like, she doesn't know who Seamus Heaney is. And I said, Mum, it's Seamus Heaney. And she said, the poet. You know.
So she knew well enough.
But at the time, my father was subsequently diagnosed with dementia, but at the time, he was starting to show signs of it. And I was uptight and worried and nervous, and God, what my father said to Seamus. And so I said to Seamus, look, my father's not well, I think it's early stage dementia. And when we went to sit down at the table, I said, look, Seamus, do you want to sit there? And he said, oh, I'll move around beside your father. And I sat beside my father for the dinner and spoke only to him and had him laughing. And my father was saying things like, what do you do, Seamus? You know? And he was absolutely brilliant. And last week I had an occasion, because of this book I'm doing, to talk to Catherine Heaney. She was a stutterer. And I told her that story. And she paused on the phone, and you could tell there was a kind of a lump in her throat. And she said, yeah, we forget, Gary, that while my father was a great poet, he said he was the kindest man I've ever met. So that's your point exactly, Erin.
Yeah, but it just oozes out everywhere.
Oozes, yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's just warmth and love and compassion. You know, it's all there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
That was wonderful, Gary. Thanks so much. One thing I wondered if you thought about was Beowulf, which both of them were hugely interested in, and Heaney's wonderful translation, and Hopkins, so much of for instance, the compound words. That's so Beowulf. I wondered if you'd had any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, funny when I finished the book on it, I realised then. I think I just referenced Beowulf once, you know, because as you know yourself, you're working on a bigger thing, and think Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon and all that, well, actually what I do is
it's not cats,
not immediately relevant, but it might be worth, I mean, because I know, for example, the Cura Troy, the translation of Sophocles, Philoctetes, he wrote about that, he wrote much of it on what he called a Catholic idiom.
Okay.
No, obviously Beowulf's totally different, you know. But it might be something actually when I'm revising this to go back and look at and see, because I haven't read. I had a paperback copy, and about 6 months ago in Kingston, near where I live in London, I went into a second-hand book store and saw Beowulf Seamus Heaney's Beowulf in hardback, and it was $2.99, and I thought, oh well, that's great, you can't beat that. So I took it down, took it home, opened it up, and inside, Seamus Heaney signed it.
No.
But then it reminded me of that day he was in Derry. He said, I said to him, God, Seamus, you must be tortured in terms of signing books. And he said, Gary, when I die, if you can find a book that's not signed by me, you'll make a fortune.
Yeah,
oh, sorry, Dan.
It's interesting there, your observation on the impact of Hopkins on Heaney. In our first lecture, the question was asked about the impact of Irish poets at the time of Hopkins. But we were really coming out of the dark ages at that time, and we didn't have that great level of poets or great poets. And it was really post penal laws and education, and Hopkins' observation of his Irish students wasn't great, to say the least. His time in Dublin was not very good. But I'm just wondering if you had any observation on that.
Yeah, I was talking earlier about, it's not the kind of take, obviously Heaney was, there's only symmetry. Yeats died, I think, in January 1939, Heaney was born in April 39, a couple of months afterwards. There's nice symmetry, and of course Yeats is huge, and Heaney, especially seeing things, again, the visionary kind of stuff. Kavanagh, in a different way. So Heaney was very cognizant, obviously, of all of those, but the earliest poetry just through his curriculum, strangely enough, where the Keats and Hopkins and Shakespeare and all that before he, as I said, he knew Hopkins long before he knew Kavanagh. But he finds in Kavanagh a permission to write about ordinary farming life. That's what Kavanagh gave him. I was telling a story, I told this to a few people earlier, but there's a lovely story in 1966 when he published Death of a Nationalist. He was in a pub, and he was 27, and he was in a pub in Dublin, and he saw Paddy Kavanagh at the bar, and he was quite he's only quite a shy man, and he went up to Kavanagh and said, Mr. Kavanagh, can I buy you a drink? And Kavanagh said no. And so it was unusual. He sheepishly came back to his seat, and then someone in the company said, oh, hang on, Seamus, I know Paddy. So up he goes again, and he said to Kavanagh, Paddy, this is Seamus Heaney. And Kavanagh thought for a minute and said, have you just published Death of a Naturalist? And Heaney said yes, and he said, I have a double whiskey.
Well, thanks very much, guys.
Thanks.